So this is the second installment of this three-part series about this, what I'm calling a mid-century modern built-in, even though technically it's not going to be built into the home. It's a standalone piece of furniture that you will be able to move around. But it's, like I said in the last video, it's 9 feet long by a little over 7 feet tall. I put all the finish on it. I have a couple little touch-ups to do, but essentially this has 3 coats of armor seal on it, satin finish. I'll put a 4th coat on a lot of the flat surfaces. And then I just reassembled it so it looks a little more complete, even though it's a terrible view in my shop. This is kind of the best I could do with the space I have. And then I'm going to be doing both intros for the next 2 videos today, because hopefully this is going to be leaving pretty soon. But you can see in the first video, the bookcases I made are on either side. This second video is going to detail adding the shelves to that. Everything has, all the plywood has veneer edge banding on it. And then I'll also get into how I made this top cupboard, which the shelf for it is drying right now, so it's not in there, but there is a shelf in there. Soft close doors, as well as the desk unit with the drawer in that. Also soft close. So that is basically going to be the second video. The third video, like I said in the first video, is mainly going to be the finishing process, as well as all the final touches that went into this. So to start off this video, I'm going to be cutting up lumber very similarly to how I did in the first video. It's these slabs of walnut that I'm going to be ripping down to about, I think this was 1 inch, and then I'm going to flip them and rip them again, and then I'll get my strips for my runners. Since these cabinets, the bookshelves are about 3 feet wide. 3 feet is usually the make or break number for the sag on shelves. So you might be able to get away with it depending on what you're putting on there, but just to be on the safe side, the runners will make it so the plywood can't sag over time, especially if there's something like books on there. And like I said, anything around 3 feet and over, you should have a bottom runner. So you can see now that I have these strips, I can go through and rip them down. So these end up being about 1 inch wide by 3/4 inch thick. And I just make a bunch of these, because I believe there are, 5 shelves, so 10 runners per bookcase. So before I start assembling these, I'm going to put that mortise in that front of this panel that I didn't use because the dovetail couldn't fit in there. Very simple. I kind of get the bulk out with a drill bit. This is going to be a 3/8 of an inch mortise, and then I could kind of clean up that hole. So the front one of these will be a mortise piece. You can see how it aligns with the 2. I did it on all 4. So then I'm putting dovetails on these. The reason I did this, and I mentioned this in the last video, is so that this piece cannot pull apart. So these don't have to necessarily be perfect dovetails as far as dimensionally speaking. So the blade is set at what worked for the piece. I believe it was 10 degrees. And then you could clean up the shoulders with a handsaw, which I usually do, but since I had so many of these, I just set up a stop on my real arm saw and remove the bulk. It leaves a little bit of a chip on the bottoms. You can't go all the way to the bottom, otherwise the saw blade will leave a mark. I just clean that up with a knife. You can see I'm doing that here. And then I could hammer these in place, and that's how all of my runners are going to fit in place. I assemble these on the ground. You can see I have the whole back portion done. Flip them over and add the other ones. Now all these joints were pretty similar, but since I didn't go through and plane and joint this lumber before assembling, each one was a little bit unique. So you could see I'm fitting each joint into place. And cleaning up, since since I made these with a router, the back of that dovetail is rounded, so I round over the back side of the runner dovetails, and then everything fits into place. So then for the shelves, I'm using 3/4 inch walnut ply. So I'm ripping it down into more manageable sections, and then I could rip it into final dimensions. The shelving ended up being about 12 inches wide by a little less than 36 inches long. Cutting down sheet goods in my shop is no fun, so I just rip this into a bunch of strips, and then I could rip the shelves. This walnut veneer ply is really expensive stuff. Just for an example, the maple veneer ply I get at Lowe's and Home Depot is about $50 for a 3/4 inch sheet. This is well over $100 for a 3/4 inch sheet. So while it looks beautiful once it's done, I don't love working with this stuff because I got just enough for this project. So if I messed up anything, I would have had to order a whole nother sheet, and in Corona times that would have been a pain. So then this is just doing the mortise on that front runner. It's very simple. I just set up a stop, cut a quick mortise, and then fit those into place. The other thing I don't love about the walnut veneer ply is the maple veneer ply from Lowe's. I personally think has a very thin ply sheet on it. The walnut veneer is even thinner. So if you even look at it crooked, it chips and frays. So it can be a little bit of a pain to work with. But once I have all of those sheets, you can see I'm just cutting these down to size. I'm using my crosscut sled instead of the radial arm sled because the blade in my table saw has a little bit of a finer cut, and I won't have to worry about tear out on the edges of these panels because, like I said, the veneer is very thin. And then I'm just going through with some C-clamps and clamping all of these shelves into place just to see what everything is going to look like. So this is what I send the customer at this point. That stick that's kind of attached right there is so that they can get an idea of how far the desk is going to stick out and how wide it was going to be. So I was happy at this point because at this point my dovetails, I found out they were accurate. You could see there's little to no gaps on any of this. Everything fits nicely. That was kind of the most nerve-wracking point of this process. So for the cabinet and the desk, I'm using my lock miter bit so that I get a nice clean joint on the edges, and it's easier to glue together because of that lock miter. It's a little bit of a stronger joint. So I simply start by cutting all my pieces down to size. The upper cabinet is I want to say it was like 16 inches tall. You'll see in the video it corresponds, it lines up with the top and bottom of the two shelves. So that was how I decided the height for that. And obviously these are a little less than 36 inches wide, and then the same depth as the cabinet. The desk, which I also rough cut, is 24 inches wide, and you'll see originally I cut it a little long, and then I'll go through and shave it down because the customer and I mutually decided to get more leg room and cut the desktop down. But the lock miter set, you can see I have a stop set up in the back. I go through 3 passes is usually what I do, and then you end up with a piece like this. So that's the flat face. You put the flat face on 2 sides, so both sides of this panel will be flat against the table. And then the 2 edges, both of the edges will be vertical against the router table. And that's how these are done. The lock miter bit is a little bit of a pain to set up, but once it's set up, I do like the joint that it produces. So then with that joint and all my pieces, I could dry fit and assemble everything. I don't do a ton of filming of the glue up of these, but then this is cutting down the parts for the desk. So like I said, this was 24 inches. It stuck out from it, so it's a little bit wider. And then just ripping these pieces down as well. So the sides originally started off at 7 inches tall, I believe, and you'll see we cut it down. It wasn't necessarily a mistake. It was a mutual agreement to get more leg room on the piece. So these are the original 7-inch sides. And then same process, I sent it to the router to get those edges, and that's what everything looks like together. So then before I assembled all these, mid-century modern furniture usually has a very slight bevel around the inner edge of a lot of the detail work in the furniture. So you can see I just put a bevel on all of the edges of my pieces. Much easier to do that now than when it's assembled. And I also put a 1/2-inch rabbet on the back of all of my pieces before gluing up so that I could easily attach the backer board to the cabinet as well as the desk. The other thing I was a little nervous about with the desk and the cabinet, because they're so wide, is them sagging as well. We didn't want any visible runners on these, obviously. So for the desk, you could see I put a dado across the top, and the cabinet, I put a dado across the top and the bottom. And then I ended up putting a runner in both of these. The desk only has a top runner because I used undermount slides and didn't want it to interfere with that. But these should help keep the surfaces flat over time, having that interior hidden runner. Then once all of that stuff was cut, I could start assembling these. Now the best way to do this is to add some 45s into the corners. People do that with double-sided tape, CA glue, multiple things. Last time I did this, I used some newspaper and some glue, and it ended up staining the lumber pretty badly. So what I did was I made these 45s. You could see they're actually screwed together so that I could clamp everything together without actually attaching anything to the piece at all. Double-sided tape would be the easiest way to do this, but I didn't have any in my shop, and I wanted to get this glued up. Winter, this was a couple weeks ago when stuff was starting to get cold, and it was just dealing with figuring out drying times and stuff in the winter could be a hassle. If you don't get things glued up fast enough, you could really set yourself behind almost an entire day. But those things I made actually worked pretty well, and they didn't mar up the surface at all. So then I just have some 2 little cleats at the bottom there. I could slide this cabinet into place. At this point you could see how it lines up with the top of the shelf and lines up with the bottom of the runner. So that's how I have everything in place. And then I'll just attach this with a couple screws from the inside. I'm just pointing out how it lines up nicely. Everything's level, which is nice. And I'll just sink some screws in there, and that's how that will be attached. It will also pull those two partitions together. Even though everything on this was nice and square, those legs are so thin they already started to want to bow. So if I put screws through not only the cabinet and the first set of frames, I sent it through the second, and that's how it pulls everything together without seeing any visible hardware. And then I just cut out some 1/2-inch ply for the back. I didn't have a whole sheet, so I used 2 pieces. As a backer, that's something you'll never see. The customer won't notice it, especially with the shelf inside, and it just saves money instead of having to go buy a whole another sheet. So then starts the edge banding on this. You could see I'm edge banding that bevel. So I put a 45 on the edge. I could edge band all the way to the other side. It's hard to see that bevel in the video, but it does add a nice look to the detail. And then once I get to the edge, I could use my square, cut another 45, and then finish that up. So this is the clamping situation for the shelves. So I ended up clamping each shelf one at a time. I don't love that. I like to do everything at once, but I just didn't have enough clamps to be able to clamp the whole thing at once. So the process for gluing all this together was pretty in-depth because, like I said, I didn't want to use hardware. So this is kind of what I came up with. It wasn't a pain. It was a lot of extra work, but I was happy I did it. So what I came up with was I put a groove through the bottom edge of one of the runners and the top edge of one of the others. I cut a bunch of spline material, and then that was how I was going to attach it, just with glue through the splines. Before I attach this, I tried to sand as much as possible. I'm really happy I did that. I don't always sand as I go, but it saved me a lot of hassle doing it that way. So you can see that the runner in the front has a groove in the top, and the runner in the back has a groove in the bottom, and it's just rip cut on the table saw. Then I could clamp my panel back into place, and I made some marks on the side of where they correspond with that groove. You could transfer those to the plywood, because the plywood you're going to be putting, you can see the marks, you're going to be putting a groove on the bottom of the front, but on the top and the back. So I could transfer those marks to the top and the back, and the bottom in the front. And then I could cut corresponding grooves for those. So you can see my marks. And then once again cut grooves. These grooves are a little bit thicker than 1/8 of an inch, and my spline material is also a little bit thicker than 1/8 of an inch. So these measurements were pretty similar on all the shelves, but they were just different enough that I did this, like I said, 2 at a time. I would do the right and the left side simultaneously. I had enough clamps to do 1 shelf at a time. So it took a while to glue this up. As you can see, there's my cuts. And then with the spline material and the runners, I can make sure everything fits. It went together pretty well. Like I said, it's a little bit of extra work, but I prefer this much more so over screws. Screws have a habit of working themselves loose over time. This won't. You can see everything's flat, no gaps or anything, which I was very happy about. Then before I glue these in place, I have to start going and adding all the veneer to the edges. So do the 2 edges first, I trim them down and then do the fronts. Veneering is tied in my book with hatred for sanding. Can't stand doing it. It obviously needs to be done. It really finishes off the piece, but it is just quite a boring job. And then I just go through with a razor blade and trim those up. I have a veneer trimming tool, but I don't love it. I find the razor blade does a nicer job. So then to glue these up, I could put glue in my groove. I could add my spline. I could put glue on all the dovetails. Do the same thing in the back. You can see my splines now in place. And this was just scrap I had laying around. I cut into 1/8 inch strips on the table saw. I didn't film it, but that's all it is. And then each one was a little bit different. You could see on this one I clamped the dovetails in place because they kind of were popping out, but it wasn't like that on all of them. Can add glue into all these grooves and then pop everything in place. Add a bunch of C-clamps, some pipe clamps, just so everything stays true. And that is basically what it entails, gluing up each side. And then with this especially, I went through and cleaned up all of my glue, which was another thing I usually don't do as I go, but I'm happy I did because it was a huge time saver.